Hello, welcome to the 10 Years Out podcast, Stories from My Queer Community. I'm your host, Sam, and my pronouns are she, her. I identify as queer. And my lovely guest today, who I haven't seen in so long, is my dear friend, Myles Markham. Hi, Myles.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me and getting your wired headphones.
Of course. Went into the archive to find them.
Had to hit up some friends. How many friends did
We're
you have to hit
grateful.
up to get some wired headphones?
Just two.
Ah, nice.
My second ask had them right there,
Awesome.
ready for me.
Good job. Okay, so preliminary questions. What are your pronouns? How do you identify? How long have you been out?
My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I don't have a preference. You don't need to use one more than the other or both of them, but just, you know, those are them. Those are the ones. As far as like identities go, I guess, I also identify as queer and I am transgender. I would also use the word trans masculine to describe myself. I do identify as non-binary, and a part of that for me is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but how I was able to kind of begin my journey home to myself was deeply connected to autoethnographic work I did. And so through specifically studying and learning more about my native Hawaiian lineage, I learned about a tradition within Hawaiian gender systems called Māhū, which means middle. And so
Mm,
that, in the right space is also something I would use to describe myself. But in terms of like the Western kind of discourse around gender identity and expression, to me, non-binary is kind of the closest way to talk about that with communities who aren't as familiar with Pacifica or, Native Hawaiian,
right.
specific, you know, concepts and traditions. So
Yeah,
yeah, queer, transmasc, non-binary, or Māhū, if you know, you can appreciate it.
that's cool. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And how long have you been out?
Mm. My short answer is that's a complicated question.
Uh-huh.
I came out to religious leaders, to my family, and to close friends as someone who, quote unquote, struggled with same-sex attraction and gender confusion in 2005 when I was 15. I then spent the next 7 years in different forms of conversion therapy and trying to pray the gay away, but was eventually able to kind of re-come out as lesbian or gay or queer in 2013
That's
when
when we met.
yes, was on the precipice of being 23. But then part B uh, started to unfold in 2018 when I was able to start sharing with people that I knew I was trans and that I wanted them to use he, they pronouns for me, and I'd be changing my name to Myles. So I was 27 when that happened, and here we are today,
Yep.
still going and growing with that.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, so Miles and I met at GCN, my first year out of the closet. I mean, I don't even know if it was a year out. And Miles was with a group of his friends who I just thought looked so cool. I was like, these are the cool kids at the conference.
Raucous is probably a good word to describe that posse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you all had stuff to say. You were all very good friends with each other, so you were very comfortable with each other. And somehow I kind of got adopted for at least the conference into the group, and it was super fun. But yeah, so we would have known
Yes,
each other
yes, through
for 10
through the
years too.
snowpocalypse.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What a time for our worlds to have collided.
Yeah, for real. Okay, so what do we need to know about your story before we talk about what you've learned since coming out? Part A or part B?
Ooh.
And
Um,
some of that you've touched on
I think
with your
yeah, yeah.
yeah. But anything else you want to add?
Yes. Yeah, I think we hit kind of the major chronological milestones with the coming out question. But maybe to just kind of fill in some more of the gaps, that exist in that timeline. I'll share that I was born and raised in North Florida, first the East Coast and then the West Coast, which for folks who are not familiar, those are the parts of Florida that are still considered the Deep South. And that is culturally true, that's politically true, that's religiously true. And so for me, I think a lot of how I kind of wound up in that conversion therapy scenario, the 7-year scenario I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, was I just had very few examples of what a life could look like for somebody like myself, somebody mixed race, somebody queer, somebody trans. I was at kind of a loss for resources, and even with you know the 90s and the 2000s, like acceptance for LGBTQ people increasing, those narratives did not make their way to me. And so a lot of what I was hearing at school and certainly at church was very negative and
Mm-hmm.
encouraged me to change, encouraged me to quote unquote pursue healing and to lose myself, in order to find Christ. And so a lot of my adolescence and early young adulthood was shaped by this idea that the way to love God and to love other people was to erase me, was to empty me, was to deny me. And eventually, I just began my own research, pursuit around some of those like theological paradigms. I wanted to understand the language. I wanted to understand our like sacred text and why it said what it said. And if those things, how I'd been taught, were true, what was the rest of my life going to look like? And it was through that exploration that um, the house of cards kind of started to fall. And I just began to meet enough people who were more like me and hear kind of similar threads of psychological and religious violence kind of playing out in their life around sexual orientation, gender identity, and race, to where it was no longer morally kind of conscionable for me to keep believing what I believed. I'd seen the damage, it was too clear, and it was no longer an acceptable possibility for myself morally. And I got out, is the short version of that story. Very quickly transitioned into LGBTQ advocacy
Yep.
and education, and really began to form, I guess what we'd call chosen family, and deep like relationships with other queer and trans elders specifically. And it was through those connections that I began to be really grounded in at least a queer identity. And essentially, since that point, I've been in some form of LGBTQ advocacy, organizing, or education. A lot of that was in religious spaces, because those experiences were not all bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I did believe, and still do believe, that there's a big opportunity for reforming the teachings that, have historically harmed us, and eventually kind of got out of that and into broader support services for queer and trans people. And that's, in a lot of different ways still what I am doing today. But I don't know. I guess maybe the only other piece I'll add to that is that I've moved around a lot. So I was based in the South for years and years, even, as I was able to come out and start accepting and learning to love myself. I was still doing that in Atlanta, Georgia, but I moved to Los Angeles in 2021, mostly for the ocean and proximity to Hawaii, but I also do a little bit of documentary film work. And so this has been much more conducive to that part of my professional portfolio.
That's
so
cool.
I'm out here now and fully enjoying the kinds of resources that exist here for queer and trans people. That's been a huge add value to my life.
Nice. All right, so what have you learned since coming out?
Oh, Sam, what have I learned? Oh, so this is interesting because I do think that this applies to everybody. It's not just a queer and trans thing. But I have learned so much about the importance and the value of directly communicating in relationships.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
And I say that first because for my childhood, my family was passive communicators. And so in the South, I think it also sort of like holds a bit of that um, way of interacting with each other where you say one thing, you kind of mean another,
Bless your heart.
or yeah. Some people think this is hypocrisy, but I actually think sometimes it is that. Other times it really is just passively communicating. You do have a kind of second or a third meaning to everything you're saying. You bring expectations, to the table around what it means, for example, to like offer hospitality, when and where and how you should do that, and who is responsible for taking care of it. Although so much is passively communicated and expected. And I did not realize how true that was for me until probably the last 5 or 6 years, how much of a skill direct communication is. And yeah, I think there are ways that specifically around queer and transness, I had to learn that. So for example, um, I've been in almost every job I've had, some kind of teacher around LGBTQ-ness and the Bible, LGBTQ-ness and Christian theology, LGBTQ-ness and pastoral care. And it became really easy for people to start treating me as a resource within of itself. I can't tell you, for years, people like all day, every day, texting me, emailing me, asking me questions about Christianity, about queerness, about transness, about how to deal with like this specific issue. I was just constantly consulting on friends, family, connections, professional, personal, means, and it was exhausting. It was unsustainable. And yet I felt so responsible for responding and taking care of all the people who were asking me to take care of them. And what I eventually got to was a point where I had to stop doing that. And a part of how I was able to stop doing that was to learn about directly communicating, which is not being rude. It is not being crass, but it's being able to identify your own like needs and wants and limitations and being able to state those to other people. And that has applied to me professionally as much as it has interpersonally. And I do think queer and trans people have to do that earlier on in life, as a means of self-preservation, being able to really discern when a relationship or a connection or a conversation is going in a direction that isn't just uncomfortable, but it's actually harmful,
Mm-hmm.
to us, and being able to be like really clear with people, like, hey, like, I know you care for me. Maybe I even know you love me, but when we talk this way, it's hard for that to come through. And so I'm gonna ask that we change, this dynamic.
Interesting.
And so that is something I've learned just like through coming out, is how to do that, when to make those kinds of asks, how to make them. Um, and so it's a little bit tangential, but it is something that I relate, directly to my experience with like queer and transness and educating about those things. I think we're all treated like educators, um, in some type of way, depending on what community you come from, but
Right.
especially if you come from a community where there's not a lot of LGBTQ people. And
Right.
so that tool, of directly communicating boundaries, limitations, possibilities, I think goes a really long way, in terms of our health and wellness.
That's
So
super
that's
interesting.
one thing.
Have you found that you mostly need to communicate boundaries with Christians who are asking you a whole bunch of theological questions or getting you to explain or like,
No, it's
no?
everybody.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty much across the board, because I think especially around transness,
Yeah.
it in the media, progressive
That was going to be
or
my second
conservative,
question.
yeah, we're kind of treated as like an emergency. We're
Right.
treated as a crisis, to the extent that people can feel compassion for trans communities. It's like through the lens of pity.
Mm.
And there's a way, I believe, that like the messaging around transness teaches people like, "Ooh, like we're so complicated, you can't understand us." And so then everybody, religious or not, is socialized to have this kind of irreverent curiosity about us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to be really clear with people about what I feel comfortable talking about. And sometimes, because I am generally pretty good like around trans topics and even my own journey, I will tell people like, hey, I'm going to answer this question. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you why you should not ask trans people that. And I want you to think about that before I respond. So we're going to have a little mini conversation before I answer the question that you've asked me, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And they usually respond well to that. I want to share another thing I've learned,
Please.
which is different from that. Um, and it's that I used to say this like tongue in cheek to like cisgender heterosexual friends of mine, just as like a cute thing to say, but I actually believe it. And it's this. Um, the opposite of heterosexuality is not queerness. The opposite of heterosexuality is freedom. And I think it's so easy for LGBTQ people, especially if like you've had those identities suppressed or repressed in any kind of way for any kind of reason, um, to begin to understand themselves in like a really static way.
Mm.
So if it cost you so much to come out as gay, um, and you've worked really hard, to accept and learn to love that about yourself, I think it makes it really hard to really be open to any other possible shifts
Sure.
that might happen, in your orientation or in your gender, in what way it makes sense for you to be living your life. And when we close ourselves off, to those possibilities, I think that we lose something, and there's a way that we never quite, the phrase that I use time and time again is be at home with ourselves. There's a kind of permission I think we take away from ourselves when we've had to fight so hard, to be who we are, it can kind of prevent us from becoming like who we can, be. Because we start to look at identity as so fixed,
Yeah.
as one thing, playing one note. And I think one of the best shifts I was able to make was like through my like understanding my gender and gender identity, um, was that my history is not my destiny. And a piece of advice a close friend of mine gave me, when I was feeling, uh, frankly, like very afraid about what gender, possibilities might exist for me. And he said, I don't think this is about finding a new box to put yourself in. It's not about the container. It's not about the label or like the identity you take on. It's about learning to love yourself, in a more whole and full way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if a label is helpful, try it on. Um, but if it's not, you don't owe that, to anyone. And frankly, you probably don't even need it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taken that and ran with it. And it's still something I apply, to myself today is, um, trying to maintain, curiosity as a way for like making space for myself, making space for others, and letting them, you know, try things on and explore and, um, figure things out, what it means to be here, to be present, to show up, um, for yourself and therefore be able to show up for other people. I think that, um, yeah, the letting ourselves be like dynamic, changing, evolving people is so, um, key, I think, in lifelong learning and growth and healing. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
I think
another
that's
little note.
that's beautiful. And I think I just talked about this in the last episode that I recorded, but I feel like the younger generations seem to be pushing towards not labeling as much and not boxing in as much and not, yeah, not labeling. And I feel like there's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah, I am so curious to see kind of how all this shakes out in the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think we are in a time like where identity matters more to us, at least like in the US, right? I do think identity is a very like geographically specific, like explicit exploration. But I do wonder, like, how will that change? How will
Mm-hmm.
that shift? Like the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about each other, and how will that inform like the way that we behave? I like words. I wouldn't, it feels wrong to say I like labels, but I do think the words, um, help us find each other.
Mm.
They help us, access resources. They help us like get the care we need. Sure, like we can start like building a world where that doesn't have to be true, but that
Mm-hmm.
is the world we live in right now. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I know for me, I don't know. Let's take the example of like finding a mental health therapist. I want to see somebody who either themselves like identifies as queer and trans, or the like main thrust of their client base are people who are like living lives more similar to mine than not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that for me means they are queer and trans. And at least one of the two, if not both. Um, and so that the labels are helpful in that way,
Sure.
right? Like finding your people and finding who's going to be able to offer, something more closely related to your experiences and, are facing similar barriers to you. I think that's the other thing is that when you're a part of these kinds of communities, that there's a real beautiful mutual aid, part of what it means to gather and to get support. And I that's another reason I can't believe I'm out here being like a labels apologist, but I there's a relationship between like labels and visibility. I guess that's what I'm trying to
Totally.
illuminate. And that's something that is important, at least for right now,
Yeah.
to still be able to have.
Right, exactly. Because labels can definitely be helpful, absolutely. And having a lack of labels can mean freedom.
Yeah, wow, that's a really good point. Because I think historically, for many people, a lack of labels meant violence, um, psychologically or otherwise. If you
Right. It
can't,
can be
I mean,
really
think about my
hard to
childhood,
live in
like,
that gray space.
yes, like so because where there is invisibility, we fill in the gaps, right? And I personally, as a child, um, ascribed a judgment, to that visibility. And because I
Yeah.
did not see anybody like me, I didn't know anybody like me, I didn't have words to talk about myself or what was going on for me. What I filled in that blank was, this is bad. I'm a freak. I'm a monster. Something is wrong with me and it needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the absence of labels has to be that, but I do think for a lot of people it was.
Right.
Maybe the ways that labels can find people and can like kind of force them in a corner, and into that kind of static way of thinking about themselves I mentioned earlier, they're not helpful, but as like, I don't know, resource guides. I guess labels are morally neutral. It's like how they function that can
Exactly.
be
Mm-hmm.
limiting or like an opportunity.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of like labels are a social construct. Like gender is a social construct. So
Right.
you can use them to your advantage or your disadvantage. And they can be something that hold you back or they can be something that frees you.
Mm. Yeah. What else? What else are we
Here,
gonna
here.
we're
Here,
gonna
here.
dig into?
Oh, what else have you learned since coming out?
Mm.
For me, so I think on the whole label idea, um, when I first came out, I think it was default assumed that I was coming out as a lesbian because there weren't so many choices 10 years ago and there weren't so many things that were talked
Mm.
about 10 years ago, and especially coming out in a Christian environment and in an evangelical environment, like, are you going to fight so hard against everything that you've learned and believed to come out as bi? Is that
Mm.
really the
Hmm.
hill you're gonna die on, or
Yeah.
are you gonna go like like full lesbian?
Yeah.
But what if along the way you feel like lesbian isn't quite true to your experiences? So, what if you want to have more flexibility? What if you want to have more freedom? What if you want to
Right.
be just queer? What if you are pan? What if you are bi? Like, all of these things are valid. So, people like to assume that because I'm not straight and because of how I like to wear my hair or how I dress in jeans and t-shirts that I'm a lesbian. And I don't I don't correct them, if they call me that. But I'm like, I identify as queer because I feel like it gives the most flexibility to my life, the most freedom to my life and to
Right.
my experiences and to my expressions, whoever I want to love, whatever I want to be. It's going to be queer.
Mm. Right. Right. Yeah, hell yeah. I love that
Yeah.
personally. Um, Yeah, I think you talk like the hair and the dress, like that's something that I think a lot about is how we express ourselves is related, to these conversations and what we're comfortable with and what we're not. And something I think that I have also learned over the years and was really hard for me at first was, when we talk about transgender experiences and we talk and I talk about my own. Sometimes people ask me like essentially like some version of have you quote unquote fully transitioned?
Mm.
And I always follow up by asking them if they could ask that question in a different way because I'm
Mm.
not clear about what they mean by have I fully transitioned. And I think it's in part because people still have this like very binary way of thinking about gender, even if they're really supportive and inclusive. And so in their minds, like fully transitioning is directly related to medical care and it's directly related to like surgical, like pursuing gender affirming surgical care.
Right.
And that is just not true
Yeah.
for a lot of trans people. Even if it's not, it might not be true right now, but it also was definitely not true in antiquity. And we've been here for a very long time, and there are people today who will never move like in that direction. And it's things like their hair and their clothes that will always be communicating, first and foremost, like who they are and how it makes sense for them to show up communally. Um, and I think I wish I would have known that kind of earlier on that um, the way like body modification is presented again, like in the trans discourse, is often related to gender dysphoria,
Mm-hmm.
which is like a DSM-5 anxiety condition. But I actually think that it doesn't have to be that to be medically necessary. And, the way that conservative rhetoric tries to frame this is like you are um, hurting your body. They'll use words like chopping up, and things that are really salacious and inflammatory. Um, but this idea that any kind of change you would pursue, any kind of way you would express yourself, in a more masculine or like a more feminine way, um, is a commentary on like hating your body or hating yourself. Or, some of the language trans people of old, would use as experiencing being trapped
Right.
in a quote unquote wrong body. And that can be true for
Yeah.
people. That might be the way they talk about themselves and their experience, but it is not like the trans TM experience. And for me, um, in order to really be healthy, to be whole, to feel good, and to feel at home in this body I live in, my like goal, again, quote unquote, the results I was looking for was just to be able to stand in the mirror and recognize myself. And I think that that gets lost on people because it's so easy to take that for granted. And I'm curious, like for you, was there a time where like you kept your hair longer or dressed in a way that fit in more to like normative kind of femininity in whatever environment you were in? Um, and was like the hair cutting a freeing experience for that reason, or was it kind of like I don't know, anticlimactic? I'm curious.
Yeah. So the first time I cut my hair short was, I mean, I was a tomboy growing up. So I had my hair short in like second grade and third grade and fourth grade. Um, and I would keep getting, sometimes in class I would get mistaken for being a boy, and like especially with the substitute teacher, and I would get really embarrassed if somebody thought I was a boy. Most of the time that didn't happen, but then around the transition from 6th grade to 7th grade is when I decided that I was going to be more girly and try and fit in more with the stereotypes of what it looked like to be a girl. So had some very unfortunate bangs. But I always liked so I had long hair for years, and then when I got to college, it was more people in the media, more women in the media were cutting their hair short, and so it started feeling more socially acceptable, and so I chopped my hair off again. And it was great, you know, everyone thought it was cute. It was still a little edgy, it was still a little abnormal, but more socially accepted. So the first time that I cut my hair as an adult, I was still identifying as straight, and I still genuinely believed that I was straight. And there was part of me that was worried that by having this short haircut that people were going to identify me as a lesbian, not straight, whatever. Which internally was terrifying because some part of me knew that I wasn't straight. But I hadn't gotten to the point of accepting that yet, or really identifying it. So keeping my hair long was a way of keeping people's questions and assumptions about me at bay. And if I had kept my hair short for as long as I wanted to, like without any worry about what anybody thought about me, then I mean I might have kept my hair short longer than it was. But I like having different lengths of hair. Like I like being able to love whoever I want to love. If I want long hair, I'm gonna have long hair. If I want short hair, I'm gonna have short hair. It's part of why I shaved my head last summer, because I had never done it, and I felt like it was something that I needed to experience and know that it wasn't going to shake. Like I finally gotten to the place where my hair is not going to shake my identity. My hair, the way I dress, is not going to change who I am. You know, I can have short hair and I can love a woman. I can have short hair and I can love a man. I can have short hair and I can love anybody that I want. I can have long hair and be the same. You know, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So it has been a process of being confident in who I am, regardless of how I dress or appear to the world. There was a long time when I was like, I'm not going to have short hair because I don't want people to be like, I don't want to be the trope. I don't want to be the cliche. You know, Sam, who was the tomboy with the short hair who likes girls. Oh. So when I realized that I wasn't straight, I was really mad at myself because I was like, why do I have to be the cliche? But now I just embrace it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I like you. I like your hair. I'm glad all of these things have
finally
led
come
to this
together.
Point. Yeah, it's funny. I noticed that when I would go back home to Florida, since having been, on testosterone and my appearance changing, every time I would visit, I would shave my face and be as like clean shaven as possible. And I would do that so I would look the most like who people from my hometown remembered me to be. There was something really important to me, like through my transition, about being cohesive. And even I like having facial hair, but I would shave it all off for people at home under the pretense that it made them more comfortable for me to look more like
Mm.
myself before testosterone. And it was always really stressful for me, like leading up to those trips back home. And during my visits, I would love to see people, but I found myself like physically uncomfortable and I couldn't put my finger on it. And then about a year ago, I realized that that was still a concession I was making every time I went home. And so my last visit, I made a choice to not shave. And I know like that little thing, right? It's very just appearance based, but um the psychological and like the emotional part of that made such a difference for me to show up how I like to show up, not how I'm expected or not how would make other people allegedly like more comfortable. Felt so good to me, and I found I had no resentments
Right.
after that trip toward people, which is so unfair that I had been doing that previously. But just by making like that compromise every time I went home,
Right.
I was creating a situation where I could only be mad at people for something they didn't even realize
Right.
that I felt like they were asking me to do. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, that I
You
think
found freedom
about
through
like
facial hair.
yes, the politics of hair. It it's true. I think kind of across gender, and it's so interesting to me how that looks and feels and plays out regionally.
Yeah.
I don't want it, gendered meaning to be attached to our hair the way that
Mm.
it is, but
Mm-hmm.
that that is the unfortunate reality, I think, in so many places. So that is like as I move through the world as a trans person, that is something I think about. And it's related to how I get treated. I do think that there's something about facial hair and masculinity
Mm-hmm.
that creates a situation where I am physically safer
Mm.
with facial hair, in being like read as like cis man
Mm-hmm.
passing than before. And that, yeah, is a something that I think about and kind of grapple with all the time that I like having facial hair, but there's like a privilege that comes with it that
Mm-hmm.
um I'm just thinking about. It's something that's on my mind.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we could have many conversations about many more things.
We're at time. The time has
Yeah,
come.
I have to go, unfortunately. But thank you so much for coming on, Miles. I love talking to you every time I get to talk to you, which isn't often enough in my opinion. Um, any any final words as we go, especially something maybe you wish people understood?
Hmm. I'm gonna tie this into a note that I would offer to my younger self.
Yeah.
Um, and that is that hiding who you are, erasing who you are, pretending to be something that you're not, none of these things ultimately serve the people that you love.
Mm,
I did that for so long, wanting to make other people more comfortable, wanting them um, to reduce stress for them, to reduce confusion for them. I did that because I thought it was best for them. I did that as like what I thought was an act of love, but I don't believe that anymore. And I think the most loving thing we can do for people in our lives is be honest about who we are and willing to believe that that's the greatest gift like we can give to other people is that we share the truth of ourselves with them and live into that because anything short of it um is a lie.
that's
And
beautiful.
yeah, that's it.
Thank you. You heard it, folks. All you listeners, do not hide who you are. Do not hide your light under a bushel. Let it shine.
Yeah. Well, I had a fun time. Thank
Yes.
you for inviting me. And I hope that the rest of your interviews are just a delight. Bye.
Bye.